Hey, Spuddies, Potato McWhiskey here, and today I'd like to talk about Civ 6, specifically some of the problems I have with Civ 6, or possibly more accurately, some of the problems that I think Civ 6 has. In Civ 6, production is too important and too scarce. One of the biggest problems I have in Civ 6 is that there isn't enough production on the map to make useful cities a lot of the time. Production has always been king in Civilization games, but you've always had some ways to live with low production cities in the Civilization franchise. In Civ 6, production is so scarce and so important that not having access to early game hills in your cities is devastating to your long-term economy. In theory, a city with a lot of growth should be really useful, but because specialist slots in districts are very weak and districts costs scale throughout the game alongside housing and amenity limits, you can often end up in a position where you could potentially work a lot of specialist slots, but you actually can't build the buildings to work those slots. It's a bit of a catch-22. You need production to build the specialist slots, but if you had the production tiles to build specialist slots, you would just work the production tiles instead and build more buildings. Things also become so expensive in the late game and the tech tree flies past so fast that by the time you build something, it's basically obsolete or irrelevant to the outcome of the game. There's a number of ways I think you could fix this problem. One of the ways that I'd like to see is citizens getting a scaling or base production. The real problem we're trying to solve is how do we convert food into production? Because currently there isn't really a way to do this in the game. My suggestion would be one of the following solutions or some combination of them all. I think that citizens should gain a base production yield similar to their science and culture yield that they gain as a base. Gaining just +1 production per citizen wouldn't drastically buff already productive cities, but it would compress the difference between a productive city and a city with a lot of growth potential. You might have one city that has a lot of farms, that's population 10, that maybe is making, maybe 10 to 15 production per turn with a couple of mines. Then you might have a city that's population 7 with a lot of mines and it's making more like 30 production per turn. Adding +1 production per city, per citizen, would sort of buff both of these cities up, but it would compress the relative difference between them and make them a little bit more competitive if you have a high growth, low production city. Another way to solve this problem would be to give citizens a scaling production yield per era. So, you might start at 0.5 production per citizen and go up 0.25 per era. This would have similar effects as the first solution, but it would also scale into the late game so that, growth heavy cities could keep up with the advances in mining technology, from industrialization and workshops and all that sort of stuff, where you get the +1 production on mines. A population with this system could generate anywhere from 0.5 production to 2.5 production in the late game. In Gathering Storm, I'm kind of including the new future era in this analysis. Another way to do this would be to give citizens a scaling production yield based on the population of the city. So, as an example, maybe they gain 0.15 base, and that increases by 0.15 per population. So, going from 1 to 10 population, you would go from 0.15 production to 7 production. It's not a game-breaking amount of production, but it's a significant incentive to grow a city. Because then when you go from 10 population to 20 population, it would go from 7 production to 24 production. And, with how the growth cost scales sort of semi-exponentially, this would would be, I feel it would be relatively balanced because, yes, you would be getting a lot of production, but it's a lot of food to invest to get that production. This would also kind of be another little step towards solving the tall versus wide problem that Civilization 6 has, where it's 99.9% of the time you're just better off going super wide and building as many cities as possible. You might potentially have a situation where you could look at your lands and say, oh, you know what, it actually might be better for me to build a couple of really tall cities because I don't really have a whole lot of hills, but I have a lot of room for farms. And that could be a way to sort of nudge things a little bit closer towards tall being a little bit better. And, I think there's a lot of people who like to play tall. So I think it would be reasonably okay to offer them some benefits towards doing that. There already are quite a few benefits in the game, but they're very small and very just nudges. And I think this would be just another little nudge that might just push things to where it's not always a cut and dry decision that you go wide. Now, I think the best solution is, like, obviously because I came up with it, it's the best solution. But maybe you could see some combination of of all these sort of above ideas that I put together. Maybe you could give citizens, half a production base, and then they get, like 0.1 production per era and 0.05 production per citizen. So you could see, I have a little messy table here. So you could see, for example, a 4 population city in the ancient era would produce 3 base production, and in the future era it would produce 6. A 7 population city in the ancient era would produce 6 production, going up to 11. And then you can see the graph here. It's kind of the only really things that you should pay attention to are these sort of numbers marked in yellow, which are the district milestones. So, for example, a 10 population city in the ancient era would produce 10, and in the future era it would produce 18. So you can see it just scales up that little bit. And then if you can really manage to build up a really, really, really big city, like a 20 population city, which is actually quite difficult in Civilization 6, you would get 45 production, which would be a lot. But I just think it would incentivize players to build larger cities. And I think right now the optimal way to play is to get a city to like 7 population, build your 3 core districts, which like, for example, if you're going for a science victory, it's usually a campus, a commercial hub, and then maybe a holy site or a theater square. Those are like, it really depends on how your strategy works, but usually it's going to be a campus, a commercial hub, and a theater square. And that's all. Those are the only 3 districts you actually need to build. Everything else is superfluous. Whereas if you could build a slightly taller city, you could maybe start taking advantage of some of those specialist slots and all that sort of other stuff that would potentially come along with that. So I think this would be kind of a, not to like toot my own horn, but I think it would actually be a bit of an elegant solution, because it would mean that investing in growth has long-term payoffs, which it currently lacks in Civilization 6. It would still be viable to focus entirely on production in the early game and build a lot of mines and not worry about growth. But large populated cities would slowly become more competitive and then outstrip production focused cities in the very late game. This way, both strategies would have sort of a window of power, with like heavy production focused cities being very strong early game, and then heavy growth cities being very strong late game. And then it would also give both these sort of strategies distinct weaknesses. And then you could also, if you're a really good player, you could have a city that's really heavily focused on production in the early game and then transition it into a late game growth city. And that would be, a sort of pro move. And now you're opening up the strategic depth of the game. And I think that would be really, really interesting. So yeah, that's sort of my thoughts on, I think really just the game needs like an injection of more production into it, because it's just, production is way too scarce and way too valuable. And, I think one of the ways to sort of reduce the value of production is to just make it a little bit more plentiful. That's sort of my solution to the first problem. The second problem is that specialist slots are basically worthless, except for in very, very rare circumstances. So in comparison to most options available to a player with regards to what tiles you work with your citizens, specialist slots just don't offer enough value to the player to make them workable, outside of a very, very small number of niche scenarios. Like, for example, if you were working holy sites when you're going for a religion victory, you don't really need, production if you're going for a religion victory. You can just get more faith, and then that helps you get more missionaries and apostles and all that sort of stuff. I think the problem is that regular improved tiles just provide so much value in comparison to specialists that it's almost never worth it to work them, except in situations where you're at your growth limit and you're min-maxing your economy on a city-by-city basis, or where you've just run out of options for tiles to work, which I don't think is very, very interesting for the player, because it means there's one optimal way to play. Whereas if you maybe gave specialists a little bit of a value or trade-off, you could make them a more interesting decision for the player to make. So these are just kind of off the top of my head. For example, I think specialists could provide great people points. This would again open up more options for the players wanting to play a little bit taller and growth heavy, offering them another way to obtain great people points to earn key great persons for their strategy, rather than, having just a suboptimal number of cities with a suboptimal amount of production and working working projects. You could sacrifice, maybe I'm going to work this farm. I'm not going to work this farm because I'm at my growth limit. I'm going to put this guy into the specialist, but I'm going to choose the campus specialist because I want more great scientist points because there's a great scientist coming up that I really want. And you could make that would be an interesting decision line for the player to make, right? Or it might be in a situation, damn it, I really need to build this wonder, but there's also this, great person coming up, so I'm going to take all my dudes off mines because I really, really need this great person, and I'm willing to sacrifice this wonder for the great person, right? I think that would be a very interesting sequence of choices for the players. I think another way could be to just give specialists more yields as the game progresses. Specialists only produce two. For example, the campus specialists, they only produce 2 science throughout the entire game, and 2 science just really isn't enough in the late game per citizen to make it worthwhile. Like an iron mine gives you +1 science and a bunch of production and a little bit of food. Like, I mean, why would you ever work a campus slot over a mine tile? If they scaled up a little bit in the amount of science they gave you over the course of the game, it would maybe go a long way to making them a little bit more viable. It probably wouldn't alone make them viable, but it would be sort of how like pillaging yields and gathering storm are being rescaled. I think it would just move the needle just a little bit away from specialists being completely worthless towards specialists sometimes providing you with meaningful value. Another way to do it would be with policy cards. One of the really coolest things in Civ 5 was some of the policies revolved around specialists, like meaning specialists used less food or they had extra yields. So you could have a policy card that, maybe gives every specialist +1 food. So essentially they cost half of their food upkeep, right? Or you could give the player housing and amenity bonuses for having a certain number of specialist slots in a city. So, if you have 3 specialist slots in a city, you get +1 housing. So that means like if you built a market, a barracks, and a shrine, you'd get +1 housing on top of the +1 housing from the barracks and so on. So you'd get +2 housing total from building all 3 of those buildings. And then you could maybe give the city +1 amenity for every 5 specialist slots in the city. And that would, again, this would kind of just nudge the game very gently towards building a little bit taller, right? And that's kind of what I would like to see, because right now I find in like virtually, like probably, well, actually almost certainly almost every single game I play, I basically never see a reason to try to go tall because there just isn't enough of a payoff. And I'd like to see just some small little nudges towards tall being a little bit more viable, because it just really doesn't feel that tall is super viable right now at all. And I think that's okay for tall not to be a super emphasis, but I think a lot of players really enjoy playing tall, and it would open up strategies for the players where they look around and say, oh, I don't really have the land to go wide, maybe I'll go tall. And then it would be introducing more interesting decisions for the players. Well, I think in Civ 6 there's kind of like 3 core ideas. There's wide, tall, and dense. There's sort of dense or sparse, and then wide and tall. And so the difference between that is whether or not you're going to try and cram as many districts into your cities. That would be dense. Sparse would be, are you going to try to work a lot of productive tiles and then do projects? And then wide would be, are you going to build a lot of cities? And then talls would be, are you going to build a few really good cities? And I think that sort of axis is very interesting. And I think this could make that axis more, these changes could sort of make that a little bit more interesting. I'll probably have to go into detail on that in another video to really explain that one. I probably shouldn't have even brought that up, the whole dense versus sparse and tall versus wide thing that Civ 6 has going on. I should probably have maybe made another video talking about that, but so that's kind of my feedback for specialists. I think they just need to provide more value, and there needs to be more game mechanics that interact with specialists. I think that would be very, very good. There's plenty of ways you could make religious beliefs interact with specialists. I think I think it just generally they need a buff. They need something. They need a hook to make players really think about, is it worth investing in them? And then you could also, depending on how you improve them, players might develop whole new play styles that they really enjoy based around specialists. I think really what I'm asking for here is I just want a bit more. More decisions that I can make that have meaning and use. Right now, I feel very much so when I'm playing Civ 6, there's a very small set of optimal decisions that I can make, and I'd like to see my options as a player open up so that I'm not always following this sort of formulaic path down the win condition. I'd like to see a few more like, ooh, well, this city would actually be really like. I'd like to have an option where I see a patch of land and be like, ooh, this would be a really good tall city. Whereas right now, whenever I see a patch of land, I'm like, how do I optimally cram as many cities into this piece of land? Like that's just kind of like, just because of the way the game is, those are the sort of decisions I'm forced into. The next big problem I have with the game is that great profit points basically lose all of their value in comparison to other great person points, and religions aren't really that useful. So one of the biggest missed opportunities in the game, in my opinion, is not having secondary religious great person slots that could provide religious themed benefits throughout the game to players. Like, for example, like what if let's say you earn your great prophet and then a new sort of great person unlocks, like JFD's rule with faith, maybe the great theologian, and maybe one great theologian instantly creates a unique building that gives all military units trained in this city +5 combat strength against people following other religions. Or maybe it could be another one, like you could have a great prophet that creates a unique tile improvement that has a unique effect, or a unique yield, or does something interesting. I think there's a lot of ways you could have had these sort of theologians, and then you could have had them thematically shift throughout the game. You could have maybe late game theologians be focused on amenities and tourism, and then sort of mid game theologians be focused on war, because it would kind of be a way to sort of simulate the changing role of religion in sort of the history of humanity built into the game mechanics. I think that would be really interesting. I think a lot of people would really like that. So that's kind of like my general thought. With regards to religion just being generally weak, I think there just really isn't much of a reason to go for a religion unless you really want faith generation. Faith generation is really powerful, don't get me wrong, but it's kind of conditionally powerful. There's a lot of things that have to line up to make faith really useful for you. And I think faith, sort of religion play in general, should be just a little bit stronger. I think there's a couple of things I'd like to see maybe tried, like with regards to editing and boosting up some of the weaker pantheons. I think one of the changes I'd like to see is every citizen that follows your religion, it could be foreign only, I guess, should give you +1 religious tourism. And I think that would kind of give players more of an incentive to spread their religion during a tourism game. Because during a tourism game, like relics are so ridiculously difficult to earn unless you, particularly on higher difficulties, unless you have a specific, unless you manage to get I think it's the Mont Saint Michel, or it's not the Mahabodhi Temple, I think it's the Mont Saint Michel, which pretty quickly goes in most games, and it's very difficult to actually get to because it's kind of a lot of the key religion stuff, particularly on deity, kind of appears around the time when you're at your greatest disadvantage in relation to the AI. Typically around early to late medieval is when you're sort of comparatively weak to the AI, and you don't start to catch up until sort of the Renaissance industrial era, and then you usually kind of outpace them by then. So it's just kind of an unfortunate position on the tech tree for relic generation. So I think having an alternative way to generate tourism would also be not only thematically fit the game, but would kind of just give that little bit of a boost to religion that would make it more valuable to invest into. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about tourism in a future video, about how I don't think tourism really provides much benefits. I think one of the most interesting things about tourism in Civ 5 was how there were bonuses and effects to the player who you had a lot of tourism against. I'd like to see that maybe explored a little bit. in Civ 6, but right now it just kind of, you have a lot of tourists and it's like, wow, okay, I have a lot of tourists, great. And then it doesn't really have a secondary effect. Whereas when you conquer someone, that has a secondary effect. You're getting their cities, but you're also making them weaker. There's like, whereas, oh, I get a lot of tourism. Great, I have more tourists. You know what I mean? Like it's not tied in with the other game's mechanics. Like, for example, if you have a lot of tourism with a Civ, why don't they take more warmonger penalties or get more grievances? You know what I mean? Like, these are the sort of things that I think you could tie into the religion. But anyway, that's the tourism stuff. I'll get into that another time. So I think... So the two main suggestions, I would give tourism from having citizens following your religion in foreign or domestic. I think it would be fine to have both. And I think there should be a secondary great person line that uses great people points and provides religiously themed benefits. The fourth major complaint that I have is that the production cost of buildings and units scales immensely high, but the actual sort of benefit of building these buildings doesn't scale at all in comparison to how much the opportunity cost of making them. So this has actually been one of my chief complaints since the launch of the game, that the mid and late game buildings just cost too much and don't do enough. I'd like to see more unique effects on mid-game and late-game buildings. Like, for example, the factory. The factory is a really well-designed and interesting building because it makes you think about, where should I put... Because it makes you not only think about where you should put your industrial zone, but it makes you think about what you're going to build in which industrial zone, when, and so on and so forth. Whereas like something like a bank, it's just like, I want +5 gold per turn and a citizen slot, and it's like, woohoo, and maybe I'll boost that with a policy card. It's like it's not a very interesting choice, and I'd like to see the buildings have more interesting choices attached to them. Often in the late game, when I have all these like really cool buildings available, or what should be really cool buildings available to me, like stock exchanges and banks and broadcast towers, seaports, these should all be really, really exciting and interesting buildings, like airports and aerodromes and all this sort of stuff. But I just find myself being like, well, I'm not really going to get anything out of building these, so I'm just going to work district projects and city center projects because it's just a more efficient use of my production, because I could build a seaport in like 30 turns because that's how long it will take in this particular city that I want to build it in. But I'm only going to, because I know for a fact that the game is going to end in the next like 60 turns, I'm only going to get 30 turns of getting benefited out of the seaport. So would I just rather not work city projects? You know what I mean? Like, these are the sort of decisions that I'm making when I'm playing the game, and it doesn't feel good. I'd like to see these buildings do more and cost less. Yeah, it's because it's just almost never worth building them compared to doing other things. I don't really have a specific solution for this. I think this is actually a really difficult problem to solve. Part of the reason I don't have a solution for it, because it applies to like nearly every unit past like the industrial era. Industrial area? What comes after the industrial era? Is it... Wait, which era comes... Is it the modern era that comes after industrial? Yeah, like pretty much applies to every unit after the... Like from late industrial, mostly from the modern era, but it does apply to some of the industrial era units. But like once you hit modern era, the price of units and buildings just gets insane, in my opinion, and the amount of production you produce doesn't really scale as well. This sort of ties in with my first complaint about there not being enough production in the game. But I think it's a big enough problem to stand on its own. I think the simplest way is just to make them cheaper and make them do more and give them interesting effects. Because like if you think of something like the seaport, right? I very, very, very rarely would I build a seaport. Now I'll probably build a seaport more often in Gathering Storm with the changes to Liang, but that's a different story. The only reason I would ever build a seaport is if I'm bored and I have nothing better to do, or if I want to purchase armadas with gold. And like, I think it's okay for a building to have a niche use. But like if you think of something like a research labs, it's almost always worth it to build me because it feeds into my win condition. Like if I'm going for science, I'm going to get research labs because it gives me +10 science after I double it with the policy card. And like +10 science is like always relevant. Whereas, +2 food, +2 gold, and then a little bit of gold from tiles is like, yeah, it's not really super relevant. You know what I mean? And I think that just needs it just needs a little bit of love, a little bit of work, and a little bit of attention. I think would be really, really interesting, and totally like. Here's the thing: you could have something like a seaport allow you to build unique tile improvements on coasts, or you could have a shipyard allow you to build unique. You know what I mean? You could, like, what if the bank? What if the bank produced interest on your, like, what if every bank produced a very small amount of interest based on your current stock of gold? You know what I mean? Like let's say you have 100 gold. Like, let's say every bank you build allows you to earn 1% interest on 1,000 gold. So if you build 5 banks, if you have 5,000 gold, you're getting 50 gold per turn interest. I think that would be an interesting mechanic. That would be unique. And then you could have stock exchanges, which would, for example, if you spend gold, which would be every time you purchase something, its price, like, you could have stock exchanges be, if you purchase something in the city, the price of everything else goes down slightly. Like, that would be an interesting stock, or maybe, you know what I mean? Like, you could have these interesting game mechanics that tie into these buildings, which right now all they do is kind of, I'm going to produce you a little bit of gold and not really do anything else. And I think there's a really lot of potential for interesting game mechanics to happen here. Now, I'm not saying this is exactly what they should do, but I'm kind of just spitballing here off the top of my head. But yeah, that's basically like my 4 biggest complaints about Civ as it currently stands, that I don't think are going to majorly change in the Gathering Storm expansion. So that's why I kind of figured it would be worth bringing this up now. I do have more complaints about the game, but, you know, with the changing of the mechanics, I didn't really think it was worth mentioning some of them until I see how the game plays out on the new patch. I do hope you guys found this video interesting and insightful and useful, and I'm eager to hear what you guys actually think of these ideas and feedback. Do you share similar complaints about the game? Do you think my ideas would actually help, or do you have a better solution? I'd really would like to know in the comments. I'd really appreciate it if you took the time to you know, shoot me a message. I will do my best to respond to every single one of them, but sometimes it's a lot and it takes a lot of effort to respond to, you know, to 100 to 200 people in detail. So you might get like a very shallow response, which is me doing my best to say, hey, I acknowledge your idea, but I don't really have the time to respond in depth. So yeah, but anyway, you know, enough talking about, you know, the difficulties of me being a privileged YouTuber. That's it for me. I love you all very, very much, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.